People all over the country are justifiably outraged because nearly 2,000 children have now been separated from their parents, and they're being held in these makeshift detention centers, placed in literal cages, and at some of these facilities, the conditions are prison-like. Now, for the most part, journalists and even lawmakers have not been allowed inside these detention centers, but some journalists are now being let in. However, they're not allowed to take pictures, and they can only take notes, and they're only allowed to spend 15 minutes in these facilities, and this is according to David Begnaud, a reporter for CBS News. Now, the United States Customs and Border Protection Agency actually did release a video and confirmed that they are locked in literal cages, and that's what you're seeing now. So the question is, why are we seeing human beings locked in cages? Why are we seeing children locked in cages like animals? Well, this is due to a new policy announced by Donald Trump's Department of Justice, where they are carrying out a zero-tolerance approach to immigration. Now, everyone who crosses the border will be criminally detained and prosecuted. And if you are crossing the border with children and you're criminally detained, what happens to the kids? Well, they get taken into U.S. custody, hence why we're seeing thousands of children now in cages. So it's really important to understand how we got here, because what we're seeing is a very fascistic policy towards immigration. But Donald Trump wouldn't have been able to do this had it not been for the cruel and inhumane policies of his predecessors, who really set the stage and moved us closer and closer towards the fascistic immigration policies that we're seeing today. So it started with George W. Bush in 2005, who instituted the first iteration of what's now known as the zero-tolerance approach to immigration. And as the New York Times explains, in 2005, he launched Operation Streamline, a program along a stretch of the border in Texas that referred all unlawful entrants for criminal prosecution, imprisoning them and expediting assembly line-style trials geared toward quickly deporting them. The initiative yielded results and was soon expanded to more border sectors. Back then, however, exceptions were generally made for adults who were traveling with minor children, as well as juveniles and people who were ill. Now, comparatively speaking, what George W. Bush did back then, well, that's obviously a lot less cruel than what Donald Trump is doing now, but back then, a lot of us saw that as something that was incredibly cruel, because he was taking this hardline stance, because according to him, Bush thought, well, if I'm really cruel, hopefully other immigrants who are thinking of coming over, they'll see that we're being cruel, and that will hopefully act as a deterrent that will discourage others from crossing the border. Now, when Obama took office, he actually used Bush's program as a launching point of his own when he didn't know how to respond to an influx of immigrants from Central America in 2014. So he also decided that he wanted to invoke a really cruel and harsh policy in order to discourage more people from crossing. And he decided to detain everyone that crossed the border illegally. And as the New York Times explains, the steps led to just the kind of brutal images that Mr. Obama's advisors feared. Hundreds of young children, many dirty and some in tears, who were being held with their families in makeshift detention facilities. Immigration advocacy groups denounced the policy, berating senior administration officials, some of whom were reduced to rueful apologies for a policy they said they could not justify, and telling Mr. Obama to his face during a meeting at the White House in late 2014 that he was turning his back on the most vulnerable people seeking refuge in the United States. Before long, the Obama administration would face legal challenges and be forced to stop detaining families indefinitely. A federal judge in Washington ordered the administration in 2015 to stop detaining asylum-seeking Central American mothers and children in order to deter others from their region from coming into the United States. So understand how this is similar to what Trump is doing now, but not the same thing. Obama decided to adopt this hardline stance to discourage others from crossing the border, and he said, anyone who comes over, we're going to detain you. We're going to detain your whole family. So if you're two parents with 3 children, all of you will be detained. That's what he decided to do. That was his policy. And that's why we saw these images surface recently of children sleeping in cages. That was a result of Obama's policy. Now, to be clear, these people were not criminally detained. They were just administratively detained, but nonetheless, that still led to them being placed in cages because there was an influx of immigrants, and Obama didn't really know how to handle this situation. It was a new issue. It was new territory. So he thought adopting this really hardline xenophobic stance, quite frankly, would make him look better if more people weren't coming, because if more people come and he doesn't know how to deal with them, then that would ultimately lead to more people in cages if he continued with this zero tolerance policy. Now, Obama made it clear that it was never his goal to separate families at the border. But it is the case that in some instances, his policies did result in some families being separated at the border. And this is thanks in part due to what's known as the Alien Transfer Exit Program. And it was actually one of the last policies carried out by the Bush administration before Obama took office. And what this policy did was take Mexican men that would illegally enter the country and drop them off hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where they originally came from. And this was another method the Bush administration used to deter others from entering the country illegally, but ended up putting these people in danger by leaving them in an unfamiliar area in the country that they originally came from. And moreover, their families would have no idea where these men were sent. So if a Mexican man would come over with his family, the children would be able to stay with their mother. But if a Mexican man would come over and he had kids by himself, then that family would be separated. But this was a very harsh policy that both Obama and Bush thought was necessary, again, in order to discourage more people from Central America from coming over. Now, as Tina Vasquez of Rewire reports, in 2011, the Alien Transfer Exit Program affected an estimated 1/5 of migrants detained by Border Patrol along the southwest border. That's because ATEP ramped up under the Obama administration as a way to handle the spike in Mexican immigrants attempting to enter the United States. While ATEP targets Mexican men attempting to enter the United States, the program doesn't just nab men traveling alone. Men migrating with their families are separated from them, detained, and transported to an unfamiliar place in Mexico, while their partners and children are left to languish in detention centers. In 2011, during the height of ATEP, almost none of the reporting about the program focused on family separation. So it's really important to understand the background because it lets you know where we are now and how we got to this situation where Border Patrol agents are literally separating families at the border. So it started with George W. Bush, where he adopted this hardline anti-immigration stance in order to deter others from coming. Obama got into power, and he decided to ramp up the policies that George Bush put in place. And now, just like Obama did, Trump has gotten into power, and he decided to ramp up the policies that his predecessor, Obama, put in place. So it really started, and it continued to build and build, and now we're to this point where our immigration policies are so hardline that they're fascistic. We're now literally breaking up families at the border. So now that you know that, it's easier to understand what's happening now. So once Trump took office, he immediately, one of the first things he considered doing was bringing back George Bush's Operation Streamline Zero Tolerance policy. And one of the main proponents in Trump's administration for this policy was Stephen Miller, who serves as a senior advisor to Trump and is also a psychopath. Now, soon after Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the administration's new zero-tolerance policy, well, weeks later, we now know, according to DHS, that 2,000 children have been separated from their parents at the border. And Trump's Justice Department doesn't explicitly say that children must be separated from their parents at the border, but this is a direct consequence of this policy. And because there's no law on the books that clearly requires children to be separated from their parents, well, this allowed the Department of Homeland Security Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen to straight up obfuscate the truth and gaslight people and saying on Twitter, quote, "We do not have a policy of separating families at the border, period." Now again, that's technically true, but it's a total obfuscation because their decision to build on George Bush's Operation Streamline policy directly led to families being separated at the border. So effectively, their policy is to separate families at the border because that's the result of this zero tolerance policy. All individuals that cross the border illegally are taken into custody. And if they have children, what happens to those children? Those children are taken into state custody. Now, another huge problem with this policy, besides it just being brazenly, unnecessarily cruel and inhumane, is that the United States doesn't have a policy or a way of reuniting most of these families. So in some instances, the parents are deported back to their country of origin and the kids remain in U.S. custody. We have no idea how to deal with that. We don't have a policy solution to this. And when these kids are taken into U.S. custody, some of them may never reunite with their parents at this point in time. Some of them may be placed up for adoption. So really, it's not just that we're temporarily separating families. It may be the case, since we don't really know how to handle this type of a crisis, that we are permanently separating these families. And as The Nation's Zoe Carpenter explains, Merkley and several others met with 10 women, most from Honduras, who had been separated from their children, one as young as 3. Only some of them know where their children were taken, to shelters elsewhere in Texas, but also as far as Miami and New York. One woman worried about her child's health because no one collected information about her child's medical condition when they were separated. Another had been told that her child would be put up for adoption. "It was the most disturbing thing I heard all day," said Rhode Island Representative David Cicilline. "They were sobbing uncontrollably. None of the women has been able to talk to a lawyer." Now, one woman was actually prosecuted for entering the country illegally when she turned herself in at one of Port Isabel's legal ports of entry, where people can actually go if they are trying to seek asylum, which you can do, but she was still prosecuted. In fact, before people can even ask for asylum, they're now being turned away. So even though we've seen similar immigration policies in the past from Bush, and yes, liberals, Obama too, this is the cruelest of the cruel. We've reached a point where you just can't defend this. It's indefensible. This is so cruel that we're not even allowing people who are fleeing violence in Central America to make their case for asylum. We're turning them away, if not detaining them when they show up at these legal ports of entry, if they are choosing to follow the law and enter the country legally. I mean, they always say, follow the law, follow the law. Well, they're trying to follow the law. They're trying to seek asylum and enter legally, and you won't even let them do that. So they're just being cruel. There's no need for this. They are being unusually cruel because, as we've seen with previous administrations, Bush and Obama, the whole goal is to be as cruel as possible so you discourage others from coming over. Now, kudos to Jeff Merkley, which is my senator from Oregon, for actually elevating this issue by actually visiting one of these detention centers. Democrats are now smartly, I think, following suit and visiting some of these centers. But of course, now that there's a lot of backlash, what is Donald Trump doing to justify his cruel policy? Well, as usual, he's deflecting and he's literally blaming Democrats for it. He tweeted out, "Democrats can fix their forced family breakup at the border by working with Republicans on new legislation for a change. This is why we need more Republicans elected in November. Democrats are good at only 3 things: high taxes, high crime, and obstruction. Sad." And he also states, "Change the laws." Now, this is just absurd. Your party controls every single branch of government. The onus to act is on you. Your DOJ just announced this policy. So you've got to own it. You've got to own that this is your fault. You could end this policy immediately, but you're choosing to not do that. You're choosing to try to deflect when we know exactly why you implemented this policy in the first place. He initially actually considered this policy, as one of the articles alluded to earlier, but he backed off of it because he knew that there would be swift and severe backlash from the public, and now he decided to carry it out anyway after one of his goons convinced him to do that, and now he's trying to blame Democrats for it? That's horseshit. Democrats are spineless, and they're not resisting you enough for just how cruel this policy is, and certainly they didn't resist Obama and Bush enough. But this is on you, and you've got to own it. But Trump isn't going to own it. However, some people in his administration, they're not just owning it. They're actually proud of this type of policy. In fact, Jeff Sessions, his attorney general, literally invoked the Bible in order to justify this policy.
I thought I'd take a little bit of digression here to discuss some concerns raised by our church friends about separation of families. Many of the criticisms raised in recent days are not fair, not logical, and some are contrary to plain law. First, illegal entry into the United States is a crime. It should be, it must be, if you're going to have a legal system and have any limits whatsoever. Persons who violate the law of our nation are subject to prosecution. If you violate the law, you subject yourself to prosecution. And I would cite you to the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government, because God has ordained the government for his purposes.
Now, in case you didn't know, this is the same Bible passage that was used to justify slavery. It was also used to justify apartheid in South Africa. And yes, even Nazis use this passage. But since it's the Bible here that we're choosing to cite, there's always an equal and opposite verse to justify the opposing argument, like Leviticus 19:33-34, which says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. You shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am your Lord. I am the Lord your God." So, you'd think that people like Jeff Sessions would be aware of the Bible's more compassionate verses that reference immigration. But of course, these aren't reasonable people that we're dealing with. We're seeing the worst of previous administrations' inhumane and cruel immigration policies put on steroids by Trump here. And if liberals called out Obama for expanding Bush's xenophobic policies, maybe it's the case that Trump would have been less reluctant to expand the policies of his predecessors. In fact, again, Trump was apprehensive about carrying out this policy initially because he knew people would be very angry with him. However, people in his ear ultimately convinced him to do that. And now he's not backing down. So Donald Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy is morally reprehensible. It's absolutely disgusting. There's really no way you can justify it. It's indefensible. It's fascistic. And I'm glad that people are finally speaking out against the United States' disgusting xenophobic immigration policies. I just wish that liberals specifically would have been more vocal during the Obama years, because Trump is using the precedent set by his predecessors to justify what he's doing now. If you allow our elected officials to keep getting more and more fascistic and xenophobic and you don't keep them in check, then eventually you reach this boiling point where they just become brazenly fascistic and they start separating families at the border. It's disgusting. So we've got to be consistent and call it like we see it. Wrong is wrong. Bush was wrong. Obama came in and expanded on those disgusting policies, and now Trump came in and expanded on Obama's disgusting policies. And the logical conclusion is that the next administration will expand on Trump's policies to where what we're seeing is indistinguishable from Nazi Germany. And it's absolutely disgusting. I know that some Republicans think that comparing this to Nazi Germany is hyperbole, but think about it. We have a literal government agency known as ICE doing raids, seeking out undocumented immigrants. If that doesn't harken back to Nazi Germany in your view, you're just not being serious about yourself. So understand that we got here because of the United States' previous administrations putting everything in place that allowed for this type of horrendous policy. And now I'm glad people are paying attention. Don't let up. We've got to stop this. It's grotesque.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/HostGator. facebook.com/Humanist Report.